What's the most ducked up thing the US government has done? The Gagasha incident in the 1968, which is also one of the worst things the UK government has done. For the UK to continue purchasing nuclear missiles from America, they asked to rent out the British island of Gagasha in the Indian Ocean to use as a naval base. The UK then subsequently sent soldiers onto the island, forced all of the inhabitants off of the island, killed anybody who resisted, destroyed all homes, and killed all the animals, so US soldiers could then turn the island into a naval base. Any ex-inhabitants who tried to speak out about the incident were immediately silenced and punished, and the details of the incident were only recently made public. The island is still a joint UK/US naval base to this day. Hard to rank them, but the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a US false flag operation to establish the pretext to invade Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, leading to the absolutely useless deaths of millions of military and civilians, only to have the US pull out and cede control of the entire country to communist control. The most ducked up thing about it is that our government knew it was an unwinnable war, but we stayed there anyway, throwing more bodies on the pile. The news media kept a daily running count of US dead. The US gov measured success in terms of number of enemy dead. I think the CIA raping and torturing US citizens is up there. They also imported and distributed drugs to black and Mexican neighborhoods. The tests they did on people are known as MKUltra, I'm pretty sure. The government also made an agreement with Japan to not hold them accountable for their crimes against humanity. If Japan gave the US the results of their horrible experiments, Japan raped and tortured their own citizens, but the level of cruelty was beyond imagination. Surgeries done without anesthesia, weapons testing on live subjects, dipping someone's limbs into nitrogen oxide and smashing it while they were awake. This was called Unit 731. Many presidents have ordered the military to commit crimes against humanity too. Obama ordered a drone and airstrike on a hospital full of innocent people, and so many people died. If there's worse than that, I'm not sure I want to know. The 9/11 shit is conspiracy as far as I know, not something concrete. During the Vietnam War, the US dropped about 270 million bombs on the small country of Laos, making it the most bombed country in the world. Millions of bombs did not detonate and still posed danger to the people living there. Both of my parents had to emigrate from Laos because of this war. My dad told me that he knows civilian people who lost limbs and others who died because of the bombs. Over 90% of the people killed by these US bombs were civilians. An entire town of black people was wiped out in my home state and nobody even knows about it. Look up Rosewood. A white mob burned it down and killed most black inhabitants because of a dubious claim that a white woman was attacked by a black cab driver. Or the sad case of Emmett Till, a Mississippi boy who was brutally murdered because a woman accused him of whistling at her. She later admitted that she lied about him. And to this day, white supremacists continue to vandalize his memorial. I mean, there was the time the National Guard shot and killed coal miners and their families who were being horribly exploited by coal companies, so they were striking. See also, the Ludlow Massacre, and the time they decided to routinely sterilize Native American women, and the Guatemala syphilis experiments. It's truly mind-boggling that we were doing syphilis experiments in the Tuskegee experiment from 1932 to 1972, and in the Guatemala experiments from 1946 to 1948. We were literally doing human disease experimentation after we shut down the Nazi concentration camps where Joseph Mengele was doing human experimentation. And the US government really convinced themselves that it was completely reasonable to inject, diagnose, and purposely fail to treat a bunch of poor African Americans and Guatemalans with syphilis without their knowledge, so they could study it and develop treatment. Compare how untreated syphilis ended up compared to syphilis treated with penicillin. Back in the 50s and 60s, the US military tested several different biological weapons on and unbeknownst to the public. They specifically targeted low-income and poverty-stricken areas. They tested things from chemicals to viruses. It wasn't declassified till 10 years ago. They also sprayed carcinogens, nerve agents, and radioactive materials over US and Canadian cities. Back in the late 90s, I used to spend time with my friend and his father, Dave. Dave lived way out in the boonies in a trailer near a small town called Orleans up in Northern California. His house was about an hour's drive from town into the woods next to the Klamath River. We'd ride out there with him, and on these long drives he'd tell us stories of his youth, including his time in the military in Vietnam. One day he told us about what happened to him when he was discharged due to a not too serious combat injury. He said he was taken to a hospital. Soon after he arrived, they inserted an fourth, and this bright orange liquid started flowing into his arm. He started feeling strange. Then he started hallucinating. He lost time. He said he was out of his mind for at least 3 days on the worst, most demonic and bizarre trip he had ever had. He would peak after a few hours, then come down, then he'd get another dose, and it would start all over again. And he was no stranger to drugs, so he knew from bizarre trips. He said he was never the same after that. We never knew if we believed his story or not. He was an odd guy, very quiet, twitchy, seemed like he was always hearing things off in the distance that no one else could hear, sometimes said strange things. Sweet guy, just pretty off. We always chalked it up to his combat experiences. A few years later, the World Wide Web started becoming more popular and more populated, and I eventually learned about this thing called MK Ultra, and I was like, holy shit, maybe this was what Dave was talking about. Residential schools towards Native Americans. USA and Canada's most recent genocide with the last school closing in 1996. It's really sad, and I don't have any grandparents because of it. They were shot by the RCMP taking my father away during the 60s scoop. My grandparents fought to keep him, but the RCMP were allowed to use lethal force. He was 5. He finally got to leave at 16 as one of the only survivors in his family, and was homeless until 18. He has told me horror stories that the schools or government won't even acknowledge or touch. Murder, beatings, sexual assault on children, torture, and other ductio things you can't even imagine. We are Saltoks and we lost our language because of it. He wasn't allowed to speak Saltoks and that was all he knew at the time. In 1968, hundreds of American troops, under the command of Lieutenant William Kelly, entered the village of My Lai, Vietnam, encountering no resistance. Although there was no evidence, the American soldiers were convinced there were Viet Cong guerrillas hiding in the village. The soldiers herded over 500 unarmed villagers, including women, children, and infants into ditches and shot them. Many of the women and children were raped on their way to the ditches and there were reports of children having been shielded by their mothers from bullets, trying to escape from the pile of corpses, only to be immediately shot by Lieutenant Kelly. Of the hundreds of Americans involved, only Lieutenant Kelly was convicted, and for his 22 counts of murder he served just 3 years under house arrest. Just the entire conquest of the Philippines from 1898 to about 1902 or so. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, and soldiers gleefully killing civilians. There is a particularly horrifying letter from a Rus soldier who wrote to his parents. Immediately orders were received from General Wheaton to burn the town and kill every native in sight, which was done to a finish. About 1,000 men, women, and children were reported killed. I'm probably growing hard-hearted, for I'm in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger. Really horrible stuff. Genocide level. Which of course was pretty par for the course at the time with us treatment of American Indians. Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson is the worst president of the United States, bar none. Even worse than Donald Trump. Yeah, I'm calling it, and I'll explain why. Had Lincoln not have died, Reconstruction could have been one of the best racial reform projects of all time. Just after the Civil War, more than 1,500 African Americans throughout the country had been elected to official office, including multiple southern states that had majority black state legislatures, including, ironically, the first states to secede from the Union, South Carolina. One of the most progressive state constitutions ever made in the United States would be ratified by a majority SC General Assembly, which made the state the first to implement public education baked into law. Freedom schools were established, and through the help of General William Sherman, blacks were allowed reparations through the giving away of plots of lower SC land formerly owned by plantation owners for some former slaves. This was the same land they'd been working on all their lives. To take it even further, the University of South Carolina, faculty and students, was majority black. There was a growth in education throughout the South, and it may have resulted in exactly what African Americans have been fighting for centuries: legal, educational, and financial equity. Enter Andrew Ducking Johnson. Poor Southerner, born in NC, representing Tennessee during the Civil War. He was a Southern Democrat that ran with Lincoln not because he supported abolition, but because he really hated rich planters in the South. He believed in the Union, not in true abolition. What did he do about Reconstruction? Stymied radical Republican attempts to implement their Reconstruction plan so badly he was impeached and won by 1 vote. His response to former Confederates: instead of upholding their ban from having federal office, he effectively pardons them and allows them to return to public life, so long as they came and apologized to him personally. It was a mark of pride to him that his fellow rich racists were now groveling to him, and the blacks in turn. His response to Reconstruction would spell the doom for the era more than any Reconstruction president. Grant dealt with too much corruption in his administration to effectively deal with the budding hate groups that rose in the South after Johnson, aside from the KKK Act and Rutherford B. Hayes in the Republican North, apathetic and uninterested in black assimilation, would throw the election of 1871 for the presidency and Democratic control of the South, which would swiftly implement Jim Crow and segregation in order to not only destroy all early black Southern achievement in the South, but blow up the Lost Cause mythos, with the pinnacle being the showing of Birth of a Nation to Woodrow Wilson during his term in office. Ruby Ridge Incident. Randy Weaver sells 2 illegal sawed-off shotguns to an ATF informant. ATF notifies Randy, and when he refuses to become an informant for them, they press charges. Court date February 20th. But Randy gets a letter mistakenly saying the court date is March 20th. Randy misses the court date. ATF and FBI set up a secret operation around his house. Things go to hell when a group of marshals shoot and kill his 14-year-old son and dog when they discover the marshals camping out on the outskirts of his mountain property. They then tried to use his son's body as bait. Sniper takes a shot at Randy, who still doesn't know the FBI is there and has been given no chance to surrender. Wounded in the shoulder, Randy retreats to his cabin, where his wife is shot in the head holding a baby in her arms, while she holds the door open for him to run inside. 11 days later Randy surrenders, goes to court, cleared of all charges. Subscribe and leave a like please.